Murder Beneath the Tides. Chapter 1. A sea breeze and silence. The great grey engine hissed to a stop, its wheels screeching slightly against the rails as the train arrived at West Marascombe Station. Summer visitors in crisp linen disembarked alongside older residents, who greeted one another with mild enthusiasm. Overhead, gulls circled lazily, their cries carried on the fresh salt breeze. Among the descending passengers stood a man of quiet distinction. Tall, broad-shouldered, clad in a dark suit with a Homburg hat tilted slightly forward. His heavy leather suitcase bore the initials H.P. "Inspector Price, sir?" the porter asked hesitantly. "Retired for the week, I assure you," said the man, with a dry smile. "Just Mr. Price for the next few days. You may take my bag." And so Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard, famed for solving the Chancery Lane disappearance and the Collingswood poisoning, found himself, at last, on holiday. Though not a man easily given to leisure, his superiors had insisted he take a few weeks by the coast before returning to London's endless noise and crime. As the carriage made its way up the steep hill from the station, Price allowed himself to breathe in the briny air. The winding road curved past neat stone cottages and patches of wildflowers, until the sea itself came into view, blue and silver, stretching endlessly beyond the white cliffs of West Marascombe. On the highest of those cliffs stood the Bellevue Hotel, a handsome Georgian building whose terrace overlooked the ocean. The driver, a thick-set man, with sun-creased skin and an avuncular air, glanced back at his passenger. "First time in Marascombe, sir?" "Yes, I was told the sea air here does wonders for the nerves." The driver chuckled. "That it does. Bit quiet this year, though. Season's not quite begun. But we've got our share of summer folk already settled in up at Bellevue." "I prefer quiet," said Price, looking out thoughtfully as they passed the crumbling ruins of a chapel on the hilltop. "And solitude." The Bellevue Hotel was all gracious charm and seaside elegance, cream-coloured walls, white-railed balconies and ivy climbing up its western face gave it a timeless appearance. Inside, the drawing-room was bright and airy, with polished wood floors, pastel-coloured sofas, and large bay windows that caught the morning light. The manager, a brisk woman named Mrs. Cribben, greeted Price with efficiency. "Mr. Price, welcome. Room 204, second floor sea-facing. Breakfast is served between 8 and 10. Dinners are announced by the bell at 7 sharp. You'll find your fellow guests most agreeable." "I'm sure I shall," murmured Price as he signed the register. He took note of the names above his own. Lady Margaret Chilton, Surrey. Captain Theodore Hollingsworth, retired. Mr. Francis Darnley, London. Miss Emily Blakemore, Brighton. A curious grouping, all staying at the same coastal hotel. Price had learned long ago that, even in the most innocent guest list, a story often lurked between the lines. He ascended the carpeted stairs to his room, which was spacious and immaculately arranged. The windows opened onto a grand view of the sea, and in the distance he could just make out the West Marascombe lighthouse, standing sentinel upon the jagged rocks like a lone soldier. For a while, Inspector Price allowed himself to do what he rarely did in London: absolutely nothing. He unpacked, changed into a light jacket, and took his tea out on the terrace, listening to the sound of the waves crashing below. For an hour, he enjoyed the strange sensation of anonymity. That evening, just as twilight painted the sky in lavender and rose, he went down to the drawing-room for a glass of port. It was there he met Lady Margaret Chilton. She was in her mid-50s, still striking in her posture and dress, draped in fine silks of a dusky violet shade. Her grey hair swept elegantly back beneath a netted veil. A trace of French perfume lingered in her wake. Her manner was warm but guarded, her tone refined yet edged with something sharper. "You must be the inspector," she said, without waiting for introduction. "The porter mentioned your arrival." Price raised an eyebrow. "I was under the impression I was incognito." She gave a low laugh. "Oh, in West Marascombe, one cannot sneeze without it becoming tomorrow's news. You may relax, Inspector. No one here suspects you're on duty." "I'm not, merely on holiday." She looked at him for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Perhaps, but your instincts are never truly on holiday, are they? Tell me, do you ever get the feeling you're being watched?" The question took him by surprise. "Frequently, but that's generally in relation to murderers or pickpockets." Lady Chilton glanced toward the window, where the last of the sun dipped beneath the waves. "I ask because I do, lately. I feel eyes on me, even when I'm alone. I've told no one, of course. They'd think me fanciful. But a woman knows, Inspector. She knows when danger is near." Price studied her face. There was no obvious hysteria or delusion, just a quiet certainty. "Have you received any threats, letters, calls at your door?" "Number nothing concrete, just a sense, a coldness in the room that wasn't there before." "And do you suspect anyone in particular?" Lady Chilton paused. Her fingers tightened slightly on the stem of her wineglass. "There are always shadows in one's past, Inspector. Even in a place as peaceful as this, some shadows come back." With that she rose, gave him a cool smile, and departed the room. Price watched her go. The port in his glass was warm now, but he scarcely noticed. For the first time since arriving, he felt the faint stirrings of that old familiar feeling, a shift in the air, the prickling on the back of the neck, the silent warning. Chapter 2. The Widow's Warning. The following morning broke clear and golden, with a salty breeze wafting in through the open sash windows of room 204. Inspector Price awoke early, as was his habit, and spent a quiet hour strolling the promenade. West Maryscombe had a sleepy, genteel charm, rows of whitewashed houses, tidy shops with striped awnings, and an old stone church whose bells tolled gently across the town. Despite the warmth of the sunlight, Price couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Lady Margaret Chilton the night before. Her words lingered, not in their content so much as in their tone. There had been something fatalistic about the way she'd spoken, as though she already suspected that no one could save her. After breakfast, taken in the cheerful sunroom of the Bellevue Hotel, Price returned to the terrace to enjoy a cigar and a view of the sea. He was soon joined by Captain Theodore Hollingsworth, a square-shouldered man in his early 60s with a stiff gait and a weather-beaten face. The captain's moustache was immaculately trimmed, and he carried himself with the bearing of a man used to being obeyed. "Inspector, is it?" the captain asked, settling into the wicker chair opposite Price's. Price inclined his head. "That's correct, though I must admit I'm not here in any official capacity." "Quite right. A man deserves a break." Hollingsworth lit his own cigar, puffing steadily. "Still, I can't say I'm surprised to see Scotland Yard represented. Rumours do fly about, you know." "Oh? What sort of rumours?" The captain chuckled mirthlessly. "Our Lady Chilton. She's been saying some strange things of late. Says someone's watching her, following her. Personally, I think it's the nerves. Or the port. But then, she's always had a flair for the dramatic." Price remained silent, letting the man speak. "Mind you," Hollingsworth continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "there's been whispers of trouble since she returned from the continent last year. Something about a gentleman friend who died under odd circumstances in Monte Carlo. Bit of a scandal, if you ask me. But here she is now, swanning about Maryscombe with her shawls and secrets." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Between you and me, Inspector, she's not half as helpless as she appears." Price turned the information over in his mind. People had a habit of shaping their perceptions to suit their prejudices, and he had learned long ago not to place too much faith in gossip. Still, 2 people in less than 24 hours had hinted that all was not right where Lady Chilton was concerned. He excused himself and made a discreet inquiry at the front desk. Mrs. Cribben informed him that Lady Chilton had gone into town on foot that morning, saying she wished to visit the apothecary and the florist. Price decided he would wait. By midday, a hand-delivered note was slipped under his door. It read, Inspector Price, I hope you will forgive my presumption, but I find myself in need of your conversation once more. If you are free this afternoon, would you join me for tea in the Rose Garden at 3 o'clock? Lady Margaret Chilton. At precisely 3, he arrived in the Bellevue's modest but well-kept garden. Lady Chilton was already seated at a small ironwork table, shaded by a red parasol. She wore a wide-brimmed hat adorned with a single violet plume, and a mauve dress of elegant cut. Her manner was pleasant but subdued. "I thank you for coming," she said, as he took the seat opposite hers. "I hope you don't think me absurd." "I think you troubled," Price replied calmly, "and a troubled woman who asks for help is neither absurd nor foolish." She smiled faintly, then turned her gaze to the sea. "I'm not mad, Inspector. I've felt someone following me. Not in the obvious sense, nothing as crude as footsteps in the dark, but a presence. Do you know what I mean?" "Yes," he said slowly. "I've heard it described before, the feeling that the air itself thickens, that an unseen observer is near." "Exactly," she said, a shiver crossing her shoulders. "I used to feel safe here. The Bellevue has always been a place of rest, but now I dread returning to my room." She paused and glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone behind her. "There's a man," she whispered. "I've seen him once, near the cliff path. He wore a dark coat, and he stood too still. When I turned to approach, he was gone. I've asked the hotel, but they know nothing." "Why not go to the local police?" Lady Chilton looked away. "And say what? That I'm afraid of shadows? Number, I thought, instead, I would appeal to someone who deals in shadows for a living." Price leaned back. "Do you know why someone might wish you harm, Lady Chilton?" She hesitated. "I'm not without enemies. I was not always kind in my younger years. There was a matter, some years ago, in India. A man's ruin, perhaps my fault. But I never thought—" Her voice trailed off. "And more recently," he prompted. She nodded. "A gentleman friend, in France. He died in the spring. Fell from a balcony, or so they said. I suspected foul play. And then, 2 weeks later, I received a letter. No name, no address. It said, 'You took what was his. The tide will return it.'" She retrieved the folded paper from her handbag and handed it to him. The writing was jagged and in ink that had bled with moisture. Price read the words again and again. "You took what was his. The tide will return it." A threat, veiled but unmistakable. That evening, the Bellevue hosted a social outing, a formal gathering at the Mariscombe Lighthouse, where wine and supper would be served on the cliffs at sunset. It was a cherished local tradition, and Price, though not in a festive mood, attended to observe. Lady Chilton was present, her manner as poised as ever, though Price noticed her hand tremble slightly as she accepted a glass of claret. Captain Hollingsworth was there too, in full naval dress, recounting tales of storms and cannons to a captivated Miss Blakemore. The playwright, Mr. Francis Darnley, lounged by the railing with a bored expression, scribbling verses in a notebook. All the usual personalities, but one was missing. Price scanned the crowd. No sign of the local historian, Mr. Everard Rowe, who was often present at such events, quoting antiquities and lamenting modern taste. The sun dropped lower. Torches were lit, casting flickers of light on the weathered stone walls of the lighthouse. A string quartet began to play. And just as the last orange light vanished over the sea, Lady Chilton excused herself quietly and wandered off toward the southern edge of the cliff path. Price, noting her departure, waited a few minutes before casually following. The cliff path wound sharply around a promontory of jagged rock and was not well lit. He expected to catch sight of her silhouette, but instead, nothing, only the wind and the waves below. When he returned to the gathering 10 minutes later, Lady Chilton had not come back. Mrs. Cribben was summoned. A search began, lanterns bobbing along the cliff path down toward the beach. Half an hour later, as the tide receded, Lady Chilton's body was found washed ashore. Her hat was gone, her gloves soaked. Her left wrist bore the faint impression of a bruise. There was no scream, no witness, but in Price's mind, one thought repeated with clarity and certainty. This was no accident. Chapter 3. Whispers on the Clifftop. The town of West Marrascombe awoke to tragedy. At dawn, a veil of mist still clung to the beach where Lady Margaret Chilton's lifeless body had been found the night before, half buried in damp seaweed, her shawl entangled in the rocks like a ghostly banner. By morning, word of her death had swept through the town like a cold gust, soft-footed, eager, and wild with speculation. The official account, hastily delivered by the local constable Mr. Biddle, was predictably timid. Terrible accident, truly. Likely slipped during her walk. Dangerous cliffs, those. A misstep in poor lighting, and he trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the sea. But Inspector Price, who had stood silently beside the body as it was retrieved by lantern light and carted off to the local infirmary, knew better. No footprints had been found leading down the sandy slope. No shattered lantern, no signs of panic. Only one set of prints descending from the cliff path to the edge, and a small tear in the hem of her gown, likely from being dragged through coarse stone. What's more, the light bruising on her wrist, while not conclusive, was consistent with restraint. As Price walked the narrow cliff path again that morning, retracing her final steps, he paused near the jutting point of Kingfisher Rock, where the wind tugged at his coat. Something caught his eye. A scrap of violet silk caught on a gorse bush. Her dress. She had come this way, no doubt. But had she come alone? Inspector Price made his way into the village proper, boots crunching over gravel as he entered Mr. Holt's general store, a place that doubled as both apothecary and centre of local gossip. The proprietor, a short man with horn-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of wiping his hands on his apron, blinked when Price entered. "Morning, sir. Something I can help you with?" "I believe Lady Chilton visited yesterday. I'd like to know what she purchased, and whether she spoke to anyone." Mr. Holt nodded solemnly. "Yes, she did come in. Bought a vial of camphor oil and some valerian root. Said she hadn't been sleeping well." "Did she seem afraid?" The man hesitated. "She seemed tired, distracted. I asked after her health, and she smiled but didn't answer. But when she turned to leave, she dropped a slip of paper. I gave it back, of course, but I caught sight of the heading. It was a letter. Foreign." "Foreign?" "French, I think. Something about propriété and debt. Property and debt. She seemed rattled after that." Price thanked him and stepped back out onto the street. French letters, vague references to a man from Monte Carlo, and now whispers of debt or blackmail. There were too many threads here. Back at the Bellevue Hotel, the atmosphere was subdued. Guests spoke in hushed tones over breakfast, many casting nervous glances toward the empty chair Lady Chilton had once occupied. A black ribbon now adorned the bell at the front desk. Price requested a word with Captain Theodore Hollingsworth, who agreed reluctantly, leading him to the reading room. The old naval man was visibly agitated, his jaw clenched as he lit a cigar with shaking fingers. "I suppose you've come to interrogate me?" he said bitterly. "I prefer the term question, Captain. You knew the lady, did you not?" "We had history," Hollingsworth said stiffly. "We were close once. That was many years ago. India, as you've likely heard. But that chapter closed long ago." "What was the nature of that history?" "I fail to see how—" "The nature, Captain." Hollingsworth exhaled a long breath. "Very well. We were engaged. Briefly, she broke it off, chose another man, wealthier, more suitable to her station. I went back to sea. We exchanged letters for a time. After her husband died, we resumed polite acquaintance. That is all." "Was there any recent unpleasantness between you?" "I assure you, Inspector, I bear no grudge. We had drinks only 3 nights ago." Price noted the man's flustered tone and red ears. Either he was hiding something, or he was not used to being questioned. "And what do you know of this letter she received? From France?" At that the captain paled. "What letter?" "You weren't aware she'd received threats. No, she never spoke to me of such things. Price gave him a long look. And where were you last night, between 7:30 and 9? I was at the lighthouse gathering. Everyone saw me there. Yes, except for about 15 minutes during which you were absent. I stepped away for a smoke, needed a break from Darnley's insufferable recitations. So you were alone? Hollingsworth's hands gripped the edge of the chair. I did not harm her, Inspector. No, said Price quietly, but someone did. Francis Darnley, the flamboyant playwright, was less indignant when summoned. Dressed in a blue silk cravat and an air of permanent boredom, he welcomed Price into his room with theatrical flair. Such a loss, he sighed dramatically. Lady Chilton was the only creature in this town worth eavesdropping on. Did you know her well? Only by proximity. She often read my manuscripts and fell asleep by the second act. A sharp tongue, though. And secrets, oh yes. She was terrified of someone, you know. Used to stare out her window, like a ghost expecting its murderer. Did she ever name this person? No, but she said something strange once, that the dead weren't always silent. Do you know what she meant? Darnley smiled. I assumed she was being poetic or mad. From Darnley's room, Price moved to speak with Miss Emily Blakemore, the young heiress from Brighton. She was seated in the lounge, pale and nervous, fingers twisting her lace gloves. I admired Lady Chilton, she said quietly. She had presence, but I think she felt alone. I once heard her crying in her room. Did she confide in you? Only once she told me to never trust someone who keeps their hands too clean. I didn't understand, but she looked so frightened. Price thanked her and turned away, feeling the first outline of a picture forming. A woman hunted by her past, surrounded by acquaintances, yet alone in her fear. That afternoon, as rain began to streak the windows, Mrs. Cribben handed Price a small item found among Lady Chilton's personal effects, a slip of paper torn from a notebook. The writing was in cipher, rows of letters grouped in threes. Randa Sil, Tid Ret Ern. Ask not why. Price stared at it for a long moment. A crude code, perhaps. The second line, tide return. It matched the phrase in the letter she'd received. Something nautical? Something from her past? He would need to consult someone skilled in ciphers. But even before that, he was certain of one thing. Lady Chilton's death had nothing to do with a misstep or the tide. Chapter 4. The Captain's Secret. It was shortly after dawn on Sunday when Inspector Price stood once more on the windswept cliffs of West Maryscombe, the cries of gulls above and the distant crashing of the sea below. The mist from the night before had cleared, but a brooding heaviness remained in the air, as though the town itself knew that the calm had been disturbed and the storm had only just begun. Price removed the folded cipher note from his pocket, the odd grouping of letters once again before him. The words tide return echoed like an old mariner's warning, and though most of the note remained indecipherable, one truth stood clear. This was a message meant to be found. Price's first call of the morning was to the lighthouse, where the reclusive keeper, Mr. Ellery Finch, lived in solitary service to the sea. A wiry man in his 60s with a long beard and shrewd eyes, Finch had served 20 years in the Navy before settling into this quieter, but no less demanding post. The inside of the lighthouse smelled of oil and salt, and the walls were lined with ledgers, maps and barometers. Finch welcomed Price with mild suspicion. Inspector, I heard about Lady Chilton. Tragic business. You were present during the gathering, were you not? I kept mostly to myself. I see enough of people when the fog rolls in, and they start shouting for direction. Did you see her leave? Finch nodded slowly. She slipped away while everyone was distracted by the fiddler, walked south along the cliff path, seemed agitated. Did anyone follow her? Finch's brows furrowed. Now you mention it. A few minutes later, I saw someone go after her. A man. Tall, broad, coat flapping in the wind. Thought it might be the captain. He's got that same sea leg sway. You're certain it wasn't Mr. Darnley? No, Darnley walks like he's stepping over spilled wine. Price thanked him and lingered for a moment in the observation chamber. The view was spectacular. Whitecaps crashing over the rocks, seagulls wheeling beneath a slate-grey sky. But in his mind, Price replayed the image. Lady Chilton walking alone toward the cliff, and minutes later, someone following Captain Hollingsworth. Later that morning, Price found Captain Hollingsworth seated in the Bellevue's reading room, a glass of brandy in hand despite the early hour. He looked out over the sea with a glassy expression, but his fingers tightened when Price entered. "Inspector, I've already answered your questions." "And you've been less than truthful in doing so," Price replied curtly. The captain stood, the brandy sloshing in his glass. "I beg your pardon? Mr. Finch saw a man of your build following Lady Chilton after she left the lighthouse. Care to explain?" The captain's eyes narrowed. "I did follow her, briefly. She seemed distressed. I wanted to ensure she didn't hurt herself." "So you admit you were alone with her before she died?" "For less than 5 minutes. She turned to me and said, 'Don't pretend to care now.' And then she walked away. I returned to the gathering." "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" "Because I knew how it would look. Because we had history, and people love to twist a story when a woman dies near a cliff." "I'm not a fool, Inspector." "Did you know she was being threatened?" Price asked. Hollingsworth hesitated, then nodded. "She hinted at it. Said she thought someone was watching her. I told her she was safe in Marrascombe. I was wrong." The admission softened something in Price's tone. "What happened between you two in India?" Hollingsworth exhaled heavily and walked to the sideboard to pour another brandy. "Margaret and I were young. I was a lieutenant, she the daughter of a minor diplomat stationed in Calcutta. We fell in love, or thought we did. But there was another man, a merchant, wealthy, ambitious. His name was Sebastien Leroux. French by birth, but with a foot in every port from Bombay to Singapore. He courted her, and she left me for him." "And?" Hollingsworth stared into his glass. "And 2 years later, he was imprisoned for smuggling antiquities out of the country. There was a scandal. Margaret fled back to England. I always suspected she knew more about his dealings than she ever let on." "And did he die in prison? Number?" "He escaped, disappeared. Some say he died in a storm at sea. Others believe he fled to the continent under a false name. Margaret never spoke of him again." Price's mind turned back to the French letter. The phrase, "You took what was his. The tide will return it." "Do you think he could be alive?" "If anyone could cheat death, it would be Leroux," Hollingsworth said bitterly. "But it's been 20 years, Inspector. That ghost shouldn't still haunt her." "Ghosts don't drown easily, Captain." Later that day, Price paid a visit to the last name on his mental list, Mr. Everard Rowe, the town historian, whose absence from the lighthouse gathering had been notable. Rowe lived in a crooked stone cottage on the edge of the village, books piled high in every corner, and the musty scent of parchment hanging thick in the air. A man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a nervous blink, Rowe answered the door in ink-stained cuffs. "Inspector Price, to what do I owe the disquiet?" "You weren't at the lighthouse last night?" Rowe nodded, glancing nervously at a clock. "No, I was sorting manuscripts. A delivery came from the London Society of Antiquarians. Letters. I lose track of time when I read." "Did you know Lady Chilton?" Rowe swallowed. "In passing. She came to me once about a locket, an old relic from the subcontinent. Asked if it had any value. I told her it was Burmese, jade inlay, could fetch a few £100. "Did she sell it?" "Number." She seemed attached, but also afraid, as if it were dangerous to possess. "Did she ever mention a man named Leroux?" Rowe stiffened. "Leroux? Yes. She said the locket was once his, that it had followed her. I assumed she meant metaphorically." "Did she tell you what was inside it?" "Nothing. She never opened it in front of me." A woman afraid of a past she carried around her neck. A locket from a vanished smuggler. A coded note about tides and returning debts. A former lover turned enemy. Price felt the net of motive tightening. Strands of betrayal, fear, and secrets long submerged now threatening to break the surface. Returning to the Bellevue, Price requested access to Lady Chilton's personal effects. After some hesitation, Mrs. Cribben led him to a locked drawer in her room. Amongst the usual travel items, gloves, perfumes and stationery, he found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a jade locket, oval-shaped, cold to the touch, with an etched design of an eastern dragon circling its own tail. It took several minutes and a hairpin to open the tiny clasp. Inside, beneath a layer of silk paper, was a folded document. Not a photograph, not a love letter. A ledger sheet, rows of dates, names and numbers, a record of payments, smuggling transactions, shipments, coins, codes. One name appeared again and again, LaRue. At the bottom was a single line, written in a different hand. She took what was his. As thunder rumbled in the distance and the sea wind rattled the windows of the Bellevue, Price closed the locket and stared out toward the horizon. Whatever Margaret Chilton had fled 20 years ago, it had finally come ashore, and someone in West Marrascombe had waited all this time to return a debt soaked in salt water and blood. Chapter 5. The Heiress Vanishes. The next morning broke dark and restless. At the Bellevue Hotel, tension was thick. Word of Lady Chilton's death had begun to spread beyond the guests. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones, and the local paper's printing press churned out a headline before breakfast. Tragedy on the cliffs, London lady perishes in fall. But to Inspector Price, the question mark at the end of the headline was not only misleading, it was a mockery. He sat at the corner of the breakfast room, nursing a second cup of strong black tea, eyes following the handful of guests as they trickled in one by one. Captain Hollingsworth sat stiffly, his paper barely touched. Francis Darnley, the playwright, had abandoned his flamboyance and wore a brown cravat and a sour expression. Mrs. Cribben, the hotel manager, paced nervously near the service door, but there was no sign of Miss Emily Blakemore. Price checked his pocket watch. 9:15. The young heiress had always taken her meals early. She had a precise, polite rhythm to her day. Today, that rhythm had been broken. He excused himself from the table and climbed the staircase to the second floor. The corridor was quiet, save for the occasional creak of timber. Emily's door, room 207, was slightly ajar. He knocked. Miss Blakemore? No answer. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed had not been slept in. On the dresser was a porcelain hairbrush, a silver powder compact, and a velvet pouch, still open, its contents scattered. A handkerchief lay beside the wash basin, stained with what looked like dried blood. Something had happened. A swift search of the room revealed further troubling signs. In the waste bin, a torn piece of parchment bearing Emily's handwriting. I shouldn't have said anything. I think he knows. I'm frightened. If something happens, tell the inspector. The bottom was ripped away. Price's mind raced. He knows. Who was he? Captain Hollingsworth? Darnley? Even Rowe? He crossed the room and opened the French doors to the balcony. The sea air blew in at once, carrying with it a damp chill. On the iron railing, a single glove, ivory silk, was draped as if dropped or torn off in haste. Looking downward, Price saw it. A faint smear on the balustrade, leading toward the east side of the hotel, where a small private path sloped toward the cliffside gardens. He turned sharply and hurried down the stairs. The garden was deserted. Rain had begun to fall, softly at first, then steadily, painting the gravel path dark. Near the edge of the cliff trail, Price spotted something fluttering, a fragment of torn muslin caught on a bramble. He followed the trail further. Footprints in the damp soil. 2 sets, one light, one heavier. The lighter prints matched Emily's boots. The others, larger, deeper, belonged to a man. The trail led to a small overlook where an old wooden bench sat facing the sea. Here the footprints stopped. Something had occurred here. Price dropped to one knee. A splash of crimson on the rocks. Not much. A graze, a blow, no body nearby, no drag marks. But then, footprints leading back. Only one set, the man's. Someone had brought her here and left alone. Price returned quickly to the hotel and summoned Mrs. Cribben, requesting access to Miss Blakemore's luggage. With some reluctance, she obliged. Amongst folded gowns and lace gloves, Price found a worn notebook tucked into a travel corset case. Inside were several personal reflections, drafts of letters, and, most tellingly, a passage. Lady C confided more in me after the letter came, said she couldn't bear to carry the burden any longer, mentioned a ship, the Paragon, said it was cursed. That's when he started watching her again. I know I've seen that name before, maybe in Rose books. Price had seen that name once, years ago. It was the vessel involved in a smuggling trial in Calcutta in 1873. Its captain had been found hanged in his cell. The cargo logs had vanished, and the man listed as financier S. Leroux. Could it be that the same Paragon had brought not only goods, but ruin to those aboard? Lady Chilton had carried guilt. The locket, the ledger, the whispers of something lost at sea. And now Emily, who had dared to ask questions, had vanished. With his boots still wet from the cliff path, Price found Captain Hollingsworth in the smoking lounge, lighting his pipe with trembling fingers. "Where is she?" Price demanded. The captain looked up, startled. "Who?" "Emily Blakemore. She's missing." Missing? Good Lord, when?" "Likely sometime in the night. There are signs of a struggle." The captain stood at once. "I know nothing about this." "You followed Lady Chilton the night she died. You admitted as much. And now another woman is gone." "You think I'd hurt Emily? I've barely spoken a dozen words to the girl." Price stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "But you knew the name Paragon, didn't you?" That stopped him. Hollingsworth's face turned a shade paler. "I served under that name," he said quietly. "Only briefly. I was reassigned before the scandal broke. But you knew Leroux." "I knew of him. He was a ghost in every port, a man who profited on things best left unsaid. Some said he died in a typhoon. Others claimed he reinvented himself as a dealer of antiquities in Monte Carlo. Whatever he became, it left a trail behind." Price narrowed his eyes. "Then I'll ask you plainly, did Lady Chilton help him? Was she part of it?" Hollingsworth hesitated. "Yes," he said at last. "I believe she was." Back in his room, Price laid out the pieces like a game of chess. Lady Chilton, once involved with Leroux, held on to evidence, perhaps to protect herself, perhaps to blackmail others. The locket contained not sentiment, but records. The Paragon had carried not just smuggled goods, but secrets. Miss Blakemore had discovered too much. She was afraid. And now she had vanished. Price unfolded the cipher again. Randa Sill. Tid return. Ask not why. He began penciling in possibilities. TID-RET-URN was clearly tide return. Randa Sill? Could it be Randa Sill? A name, a location? He flipped to Rowe's local history volume, on West Marascum, searching the index. There. Randasill's Cove, an old smuggler's inlet at the base of the eastern cliffs, cut off at high tide, only accessible for 2 hours after dawn or dusk. It would be accessible now. With lantern and revolver in hand, Price made his way down the narrow path to Randasill's Cove, his boots crunching over wet pebbles as he descended. The cove was narrow, walled by black stone, and hidden from above. There, tucked against a crevice in the rock, he saw it, a splash of pale muslin. He rushed forward. Emily Blakemore, unconscious but breathing, was tied to an old timber post, a rag bound over her mouth. Her forehead bore a small cut, likely from a fall. Beside her, a broken lantern. Price knelt, loosening the binds quickly. "Miss Blakemore, you're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open. "Inspector, he said I knew too much. He said the sea buries what we're too cowardly to face." "Who, Emily? Who was it?" But she fainted before she could answer. And the tide was coming in. Inspector Price lifted her in his arms and turned toward the winding path. There was still time, but not much. The secrets of the Paragon had nearly claimed another life. But now Price knew where to look, and who to look at. Chapter 6. A storm breaks over Marriscombe. By mid-afternoon, West Marriscombe was sealed in grey. Inside the Bellevue Hotel, the mood had turned anxious. The hotel's guests, few as they were, had gathered in the drawing room, huddled by the fire like survivors of a shipwreck, uncertain, alert, and very much aware that something was wrong. Price stood near the hearth, staring into the flames, his hands clasped behind his back. He had spent most of the morning with the local doctor, who attended to Miss Emily Blakemore after her dramatic rescue from Randasil's Cove. She was safe, resting, but what disturbed Price most was not what Emily had told him before slipping into unconsciousness. It was what she hadn't said. She had seen her attacker, but either she couldn't remember his name, or she had been too frightened to speak it aloud. Price suspected the latter, and now, with the weather trapping everyone inside the Bellevue, he knew the time had come to close the net. At precisely 6:30, the great bronze bell at the front of the hotel rang out. Mrs. Cribben, her face white, her hands clasped tightly around her appointment book, had summoned all guests to the lounge under Inspector Price's instruction. By 7 o'clock the suspects had gathered, drawn together by equal parts curiosity, dread, and resignation. Captain Theodore Hollingsworth, stiff in posture, hands behind his back, as though standing on the quarterdeck of a ship. Francis Darnley, arms folded, peering over his spectacles like a stage director studying a final rehearsal. Mr. Everard Rowe, the historian, pale and fidgeting, glancing often at the grandfather clock. Mrs. Cribben seated near the door, her face unreadable. Only Miss Emily Blakemore remained absent, per doctor's orders. Price stood before them, his expression grave but composed. "No need to lock the doors," Price began. "The storm has done that for us. But before the wind quiets and the morning sun returns, we shall settle the matter of Lady Chilton's murder and the attempted murder of Miss Blakemore." Gasps fluttered around the room. Captain Hollingsworth stiffened. Darnley adjusted his cravat. Rowe swallowed hard. "Yes," Price said, "attempted murder. Miss Blakemore was found unconscious and bound at the base of the cliffs. If I had arrived half an hour later, the tide would have claimed her." He turned toward the fire and began to pace slowly. The room fell utterly silent. "You all knew Lady Chilton, though you each claimed to have known her only in part. But the truth is, Margaret Chilton had long been a woman burdened by secrets and by guilt." He turned toward Hollingsworth. "You, Captain, knew her in India. You were once engaged to her, but she left you for a man named Sebastian Leroux, a man later exposed as a smuggler and traitor." Hollingsworth's face darkened. "I don't deny it. And you suspected, as I do, that Lady Chilton was more than a bystander in his crimes." Price held up the jade locket retrieved from Margaret's belongings. This contained a ledger chronicling the shipments and deals from Leroux's time aboard the Paragon, a smuggling vessel that vanished from British waters under a cloud of suspicion and scandal. This locket was both a memory and a threat. Someone wanted it silenced, someone who feared what it might expose. He turned to Darnley, who raised an eyebrow. "You, sir, claimed you barely knew the lady, yet you wrote her into your play. A veiled character, the widow of the Eastern Wind, was it not?" Darnley smiled thinly. "A dramatist draws from life, Inspector. And in drawing from life, you hinted that you knew her past." "I suspected," Darnley said, "but knowledge is not guilt." "Unless it can be sold," Price said evenly. "You were blackmailing her. The moment you saw the locket, you realized what you had." "That's absurd," Darnley snapped. You followed her that night," Price cut in, "but you weren't the only one." He turned his gaze toward Mr. Rowe, who now looked positively ill. "You claim to be a simple historian, but you knew of Leroux, you knew of the Paragon, and more importantly, you were the one who deciphered the coded message." He held up the folded cipher. "A clever trick, really. Randasil Cove, tide return. You knew where the ledger was. You knew what it would reveal." Rowe tried to speak, but his throat failed him. "Lady Chilton gave you the locket for safekeeping. You told her you'd hide it. Instead, you copied it, studied it, and began searching for the rest of LaRue's trail. Why would I harm her? Roe finally blurted. She trusted me. You feared what she might do next. She had written to the authorities in London. I found a draft in her papers. She was going to confess. You panicked. Roe stood trembling. That's a lie. No, Price said quietly, but it's not you I'm here to arrest. Roe froze. Every eye turned toward the fire, where Captain Hollingsworth now stood motionless, his jaw set. You followed her that night, Captain, Price said. Finch saw you. You admitted it. But you didn't just check on her. You argued. She accused you. She told you she was going to the authorities. Price stepped closer. She had discovered the truth, hadn't she? That you had been working with LaRue all along, that you were a junior officer aboard the Paragon, using your naval status as a cover. You were his broker in the Empire. Hollingsworth's hand twitched. She thought you dead, or reformed. But then she saw your name in an old telegram. That's why she called you here. Not for comfort, but for confrontation. And when she threatened to expose you, Price paused, you killed her. A long silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the storm beyond. You don't understand, Hollingsworth said at last, his voice low, ragged. I built a life, a clean life. I left all of it behind. I was done with LaRue, with the black ships, with the bribes. And then she came back, with the ledger. That ledger could have destroyed me. Price didn't move. She said she wanted to put things right, to confess, but she never saw the cost. If that ledger surfaced, my pension, my name, everything would be gone. So you silenced her, Price said. I only meant to frighten her, Hollingsworth said bitterly. But she pulled away, slipped. I grabbed her wrist. She screamed. You left her to drown, Price finished. The captain sat heavily in his chair, aged in a moment. I thought the sea would wash it clean. It never does, Price replied. The storm raged as Price telephoned for the local constable, who arrived soaked and pale. Captain Hollingsworth surrendered without resistance. As he was led away, he turned to Price and said, You were never really on holiday, were you? Price met his eyes. Number I don't believe I ever have been. The next morning the sea was calm again. Gulls circled lazily overhead. The mist had lifted, and golden sunlight glinted off the waves. Emily Blakemore awoke in her bed, still weak but safe. When Price visited, she smiled faintly. It's over, she asked. Not quite, he said, but the worst has passed. She nodded. I heard you found the ledger. Will it all come out? Yes, it must. That afternoon, Price walked alone to the edge of the cliffs, gazing down at Randersil's Cove, where sea foam curled like breath on a sleeping beast. The tide had come in and gone out again, but this time it had left the truth behind. Chapter 7. Murder Beneath the Tides. 3 days after the arrest of Captain Theodore Hollingsworth, the town of West Maryscombe returned to its quiet rhythm. Its storefronts reopened, the bells of St. Winifred's resumed their soft tolling, and children once again gathered shells along the sandbanks. At the Bellevue Hotel, Inspector Harold Price sat in the sunroom, gazing out toward the sea with a cup of Darjeeling untouched beside him. The morning sun glimmered off the waves, but his thoughts were not with the weather. He held in his hand the last page of the Paragon ledger, now part of a sealed evidence file destined for the Home Office. Names, codes, payments, smuggling routes from Calcutta to Lisbon. Among them, his trained eyes had caught something peculiar. A signature, not LaRue's, not Hollingsworth's, but a third man. One who had, until now, remained comfortably in the background. E. Rowe. Price knocked once on the door of Everard Rowe's cottage before stepping in. Rowe sat by the hearth, his spectacles slightly fogged, his fingers trembling around a teacup. I was wondering when you'd come, he said quietly. Price handed him the file. It was you all along, wasn't it? Rowe gave a faint smile. Not all of it. I didn't kill Margaret. I didn't bind that poor girl and leave her for the sea. But I did lie. I did know the ledger's value. I helped LaRue once, just once. I was young. I translated shipment manifests into Latin for him, helped him disguise names, cloaked them in historical codes. I thought it was clever. I thought I was a scholar. And when the Paragon went down, I stayed silent. I burned the letters, but the locket, Margaret found me years later, asked if I still remembered the code. I told her I'd forgotten. He laughed bitterly. I hadn't. You decoded the message for her? He nodded. She said she needed to confront her past, that she wanted to make things right before it was too late. I thought she was brave. He looked up, his eyes glassy. Then she died, and I was a coward. Were you the one who sent the threat? Number. But I knew about it. Darnley had found fragments of the ledger. He thought he could profit from them. Hollingsworth must have seen him approach Margaret at the gala. Thought she'd shared everything. That's when he panicked. Price studied him. You'll need to provide a full statement. The Home Office will want every name on this list traced. Rose sighed. And they should. There's justice to be done. Too many lives buried beneath those tides. 2 days later, under grey skies and a soft drizzle, Lady Margaret Chilton was laid to rest in the small hilltop cemetery overlooking the sea. The headstone was modest, but fresh wildflowers lined its base, placed, Price suspected, by Miss Emily Blakemore, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd in a black veil and a simple coat. After the service, she approached him. I owe you my life, she said softly. You owe me nothing, Price replied, but I hope you'll make good use of the one you have. She smiled faintly. I plan to return to Brighton, finish my education, maybe write something truthful about what happened here. He nodded. The world always needs honest stories. That evening, as he packed his bag to return to London, Price received a letter slipped under his door. The envelope was heavy, parchment embossed with the Bellevue crest. Inside, a note in looping feminine script. Inspector Price. If you are reading this, then my fears were not unfounded. I trust that you have done what was necessary, because I saw in your eyes the weight of a man who has done so before. I leave no heirs and no cause for sentiment, but I ask this of you. Let the truth be known, even if it does not flatter the dead. Let the Paragon be named. Let the sins of those days finally be washed away by the tide. Yours, Margaret C. Price, folded the letter gently and tucked it into his coat pocket. At noon the following day, the train to London pulled into the West Maryscombe station. Price boarded with his satchel and coat, taking a window seat as the engine hissed and began its slow retreat from the coast. As the Bellevue Hotel faded from view and the cliffs gave way to rolling fields, Price allowed himself a moment of stillness. His holiday had ended before it began, but justice once again had been served, quietly, firmly, and without spectacle. Epilogue. Beneath the tides. Far below the cliffs, beneath the churning waters of Randasill's Cove, the sea held its silence. The wreckage of the Paragon, long broken, long forgotten, lay deep in the shadows, its secrets scattered among barnacle-covered timbers and rusted chains. But no secret, however deeply buried, remains hidden forever. Not in the tides, not in time, and certainly not in the presence of Inspector Price of Scotland Yard.